What makes the Rioja region of Spain a must-visit destination for wine lovers? What are the best food pairings for Rioja wines? And what's the sticky history behind the Battle of Wine Festival in La Rioja? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Adam Lechmere, editor of the Smart Traveler's Wine Guide to Rioja, among other books in this series. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover why many people assume that all Spanish wine is from Rioja, how the Smart Traveler's Wine Guide series is ideally suited to wine-interested visitors, some of the culinary traditions you can enjoy in Logroño, the capital of La Rioja, which Rioja wine and tapas pairings you should try, the surprising insight about Rioja that Adam learned while editing the Smart Traveler's Wine Guide to Rioja, what it was like to interview the famous movie director and winery owner Francis Ford Coppola in his own home, the parallels between the worlds of wine and film, why documentary filmmaker Jonathan Nossiter walked out of his interview with Adam, and why Adam was twice banned from Château Latour in Bordeaux. All right, let's dive in. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 303. Two of you are going to win a copy of the terrific new book, The Smart Traveler's Wine Guide to Rioja, written by Fintan Kerr and edited by our guest, Adam Lechmere. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose two people randomly from those who contact me. In other book news, the new audiobook of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, is on sale now for 60% off, so that's just $8 at audiobooks.com until September 23rd, so only about another week. That's at audiobooks.com. You can also get it from audible.com, Kobo, Spotify, Google Play, Libro FM, and wherever else you get audiobooks. If you started listening to the audiobook or are reading the paperback or ebook, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/303. Okay, on with the show. Adam Lechmere is the publishing director of Académie de Vin Library and consulting editor to Club Enologique, which he launched in 2018. He is also the general manager of the Académie de Vin Foundation, which is a charity dedicated to improving diversity in wine and hospitality worldwide. Adam has been writing about wine for 25 years. He has been contributing to Decanter, Decanter.com, World of Fine Wine, Menninger's, JaneAnson.com, The Guardian, and other publications. He joins me now from his home in London. It's so great to have you here with us, Adam. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Natalie. Good to see you.
All right, cheers. So before we dive in to the new book on Rioja, I'd love to touch on some of your most memorable wine moments over your long career. Maybe starting with your interview of the famous movie director and California winery owner, Francis Ford Coppola.
Well, yes, that was a really fantastic couple of days, actually. I went to Inglenook in Napa to meet Coppola. The occasion, this was 2011, and the occasion was Francis Ford Coppola had been buying the winery and the winery buildings at Inglenook for some years. He'd been gradually increasing what he owned.
And that's a really historic winery, isn't it?
It's one of the legendary Napa wineries, yes. It was started by the Finnish fur trader and ship captain Gustav Niebaum in the 1890s. And then during the 20th century, it was sold off to a group called the Wine Group and lost all its sheen, lost all its reputation, the wine group turned Inglenook into a jug wine, a bottom shelf jug wine. But, Coppola always knew that it had the finest vineyards there on the Rutherford Bench. For many years, made a wine he called the wine Rubicon, and also there's a couple of others as well, because he couldn't call it Inglenook because he didn't own the name. So in 2011, he finally managed to buy the name from the wine group, and then he could start calling his wine Inglenook again. I asked him how much it cost him, and he said it cost him as much as to buy the mansion itself at Inglenook, and the mansion cost him $14 million. So I think the actual buying the copyright to that name, the trademark, was expensive. But his winemaker, he just employed Philippe Bascol, who was the winemaker at Château Margaux. He poached him from Margaux, in fact, and Philippe was there when I was there, and he barely started, so he was exploring the vineyards almost in the same way that I was at that stage. Obviously knew them a good deal better than I did. So we walked the vineyards together, and then we sat down with Mr. Coppola, and we interviewed him, and then we had lunch with him. He gave us dinner at the mansion, T-bone steak, which he cooked himself. He fancies himself as a great cook, and he is. Eleanor was there. Eleanor Coppola was there, his wife, who is a considerable person in her own right, obviously. About, I'd probably say, half the size and weight of her husband, but a really, really remarkable person. It was amazing to sit down with those two, amazing to talk about film and talk about wine. And if you're a huge fan of Coppola, as I am, then that was equally exciting.
Absolutely. I mean, he's made so many iconic films. I mean, I'm sure most people are familiar, but like Dracula, and what was the one about the war? Was it Apocalypse Now? Was that his?
Indeed, Apocalypse Now was, well, obviously his famous films of the Godfather trilogy is what made his name. And then Apocalypse Now, I think, is as iconic and as famous. And of course, Eleanor, his wife, made a documentary about Apocalypse Now.
Ah, I didn't know that.
And the name has just suddenly left me. It's a brilliant documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, because everybody went slightly mad on set because it went massively over budget. It just got very, very heated. And I still think it's an amazing film.
It is. And you can see a lot of this memorabilia he has a winery, I think, right beside it, the Francis Ford Coppola winery, where he has the desk from The Godfather and an old car from one of the movies. I forget which one that was, but you can see a lot of that memorabilia in the other winery, right?
Yeah, that's the car from Tucker, is it called?
Oh, yeah, Tucker, yeah.
Yeah, he's got the Godfather desk. He's got the power boat, the patrol boat from Apocalypse Now is up there on the hill. I think they had to make several versions of it. I think it's just made of plywood. It's not kind of seaworthy. I think that's a model that he's got there. I can't remember where all the memorabilia is now. I don't want to send people all the way to Inglenook just hoping to see lots of Apocalypse iconic movie memorabilia there, because I think a lot of it might still be in the Francis Ford Coppola winery, but he's also sold that now. That's in Sonoma.
Oh, he has?
That's been sold, so don't quote me on that. If you want to go there, you have to look it up.
Absolutely. And did he have insights, or did he say anything surprising, anything about the intersection of wine and film, or why he was passionate about both?
Not really, to be honest. He's a very, very focused man. The interview was about wine. My job was to interview him about wine. And I, of course, wanted to get into film. And he talked about a couple of the movies he was making. And this was 12 years ago, remember. But really, we didn't talk that much about the films. Well, he talked about how Apocalypse Now bankrupted him. As a result, he had to make quite a lot of films that he might not have made otherwise. Things like Peggy Sue Got Married, He made a lot of films that were really just in order to bring the cash in.
Right.
And they're still great films.
That has parallel with wine.
Well, indeed. Yeah. And he obviously talked about the business of directing a film. He's quite a witty sort of guy, and he was talking about how he knows nothing about film, he knows nothing about wine, he just knows how to employ the right people, basically. And I find a lot of extremely successful people often kind of say that their major skill is their ability to read character and their ability to employ the right people and get the best out of them. So, of course, there he employed Philippe Bascol, who was one of the best jobs in Bordeaux, obviously, at Château Margaux, but also quite young and quite new in that, and Philippe is now back at Margaux and is working at both properties and is now very senior at Margaux. But yeah, the idea that you get the right people to work for you, I think, is very potent with successful people.
Absolutely. Definitely a thread that goes through it all. Now, you also interviewed the documentary filmmaker Jonathan Nossiter. He made the documentary about the wine world, Mondovino. What happened with that interview? It turned out quite differently.
Well, yes. I mean, we're going back into the mists of time here because this was back in 2005 or something. He made this film, Mondovino. I've got no gripe with Jonathan Nossiter whatsoever, but I never liked that film. I thought it was very much a polemic. He had a point of view and he wanted to get that point of view across. And the point of view was sort of basically, very simply, corporation bad, artisan good. And this was at the stage when the Mondavi family wanted to buy land in Aniane in Languedoc in the south of France, very close to the very famous producer Madame Gassac. There was a feeling in the region at the time that the big corporation was going to come in and take over and, ruin everything for the tiny artisan producers, which wasn't the case at all. The Mondavis are a very serious operator. I just didn't like the way the film was sort of portrayed the Mondavis and portrayed a lot of people in Napa. It's very, very unkind to a lot of people. And also taking the view that, everything Michel Rolland did was bad,
Right. The flying consulting winemaker who famously consults all over the world.
Exactly. And this was at a time in the mid-2000s when bashing Michel Rolland was a very popular thing and bashing Robert Parker was a popular thing as well. We won't get into Parker now. But anyway, I put this to him in the interview very early on. I didn't attack him or anything, but I said, I think your films are polemic, which I suppose was quite an insulting thing to say in a way because nobody likes to be told they're a polemicist. And he walked out. And I suppose that's sort of, some people say that the best interview is the one that the interviewee walks out of, because after all, it's not our business to become friends with the people we interview. But having said that, I haven't had anything to do with Jonathan Nossiter for many, many years. And he's a serious filmmaker. He was then a serious filmmaker. He's making tomato sauce now in Umbria, I'm told. I think he's given up filmmaking. But I don't want to sort of rake over any old coals,
No, but it takes all types. And I'm sure you've had so many other interviews too with different reactions. Yeah. And so now, speaking of more mischief, but you've been visiting Bordeaux for 25 years, doing annual tastings and so on, or maybe more than that. But you were banned twice from one of the top 5 estates, Château Latour. Why was that?
Well, yes, again, I mean, it's not something that has any great moment at all. It's not particularly important. I'm not sure I should be going into this, really. It might sort of open some old wounds. But we did when I was at Decanter, we did an April Fool on where we said that the North Korean leader, Kim Il-jong, had bought the entire consignment of Ford de Latour, the second wine of Château Latour. We sort of made it very elaborate, and we quoted Frédéric Angeret, the director, and we quoted Kim Il-jong saying that he was delighted to get a jump on the Chinese, who at that stage were buying lots of properties in Bordeaux and buying up Bordeaux. And it didn't go down very well. It was a very stupid thing to do, actually, because I was at Decanter at the time, and we at the time were putting on a tasting with all 5 first growths, and Sarah Kemp, my boss at the time, and Sarah Kemp is a renowned and extremely brilliant publisher, brilliant businesswoman. She was rightly, absolutely furious. But to her credit, she didn't fire me, to her credit.
I think that's creative. Whatever trouble it might have caused, it was still better than the usual.
It was quite funny, actually. I think a lot of people found it quite funny. Yeah, it was only up on the website for about 20 minutes before we had to take it down. So.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. So before we dive into the book, 2 quick questions, just again, to get to know you through some of these different moments you've had. But if your mother wrote a book about you, what do you think the title would be, Adam?
You warned me about this question. I've been thinking about it ever since. I think the only thing that question illustrates is what... You're familiar with the works of P.G. Wodehouse with Bertie Wooster?
Yes.
Bertie Wooster, I mean, in one story, Jeeves pulled off some amazing feat, and Bertie Wooster said, Jeeves, you're so incredibly clever, you're so intelligent, and, have you always been like this? And Jeeves said, well, my mother believed me intelligence. And Bertie Wooster said, well, that doesn't mean anything. My mother thought I was intelligent. So one's mother's always one's biggest fan. So I imagine my mother's book would be something like My Son's Brilliant Career or something, which is as far from the truth as you can imagine.
It's good to have supportive parents. My mother probably would have titled her book, I Told You Not to Do That.
Yes, possibly. Yes,
anyway,
possibly. Yes. That's another one.
Maybe it was a subtitle. And if your high school yearbook had superlatives, what would you have been voted most likely to become?
I have no idea. Well, presumably, my friends, they would have said, he's going to do something. Enemies, I don't know. I mean, what I've become is a world-class procrastinator. That's one thing I can say without any doubt.
Doubt they had that category, but that's good to realize your dreams. All right, let's get into the book. What was the most surprising thing you learned while editing The Smart Traveler's Wine Guide, Rioja?
Well, yes, I thought about this. I know Rioja quite well, and this is a book for, it's not a specialist academic book, so there's a lot of information in there that I already knew. But what I'd loved to see was the incredible wealth of amazing architecture in Rioja and the kind of exuberance with which they're doing things. And there's a couple of hotels that we've put in there that I'd never visited. Everybody knows Marqués de Riscal, for example, the famous titanium-clad Frank Gehry building that was designed to look like a flamenco dancer's skirt. And that's still...
Oh, is that what it was designed to do? Like, I always wondered...
I think that's one of his ideas, the sort of swish of a flamenco dancer's skirt over the vineyards. And that building is now 25 years old. I forget when it was actually built. It was maybe just over 20 years old, maybe, but it is still as surprising every time you see it. And in the book, we've got the most beautiful double-page spread of the building. And what they do in Rioja so brilliantly is that they have the ultra modern, avant-garde, postmodern buildings literally next door to these ancient, gorgeous medieval churches, So let me just remind myself, in Villabuena de Álava, you've got the Villora Hotel, which is the most extraordinary collection. It looks like a collection of white boxes that have just literally been dropped from the sky. They're all higgledy-piggledy, all at angles. And they sit, look up Villora Hotel in Rioja, and they sit literally in the lap of the Church of San Juan, which is next door to it. And literally you can go from the door of the church to this hotel in about 10 steps. It's quite extraordinary. And again, we've got this gorgeous double-page spread of this. And it's just this perfect illustration of how in Rioja they just celebrate their ancient history.
So you find it still can work together?
Yes. At the same time as celebrating modernity and just in the coolest way.
Huh. That's fascinating. I'm going to ask you, are you saying it, I believe I'm mispronouncing it because you would know, are you putting a hard K on that, Rioja?
No. Your way is absolutely fine, Natalie. We put the J in Spanish is the H sound. So it's halfway between a K and it's the guttural. And so we just say Rioja. It's actually sort of halfway between an H and a K, really.
Okay, yeah. Well, I want to say it like the cool kids do.
And we say O. It's a long O rather than an O. So you say Rioja, but we say Rioja. But then you say tomato,
Rioja.
We say tomato. So,
There you go. I like that. I want to say it like the cool kids do. So, Rioja.
Well, yeah,
okay.
Well, the cool kids, yes.
What makes the Smart Traveler's Wine Guide to Rioja different from other books? You said it's actually not an academic treatise, of course. Is it meant to be just a traveling guide like you would get with photos, but the wine version?
Yeah, absolutely. We think that we've actually hit a niche that is not being exploited at the moment. It's basically a wine guide for travellers, for wine-interested travellers. And so it's not in any way academic, but it's for the kind of people who love to go on holiday to wine regions and often will choose a wine region for their holiday because they love visiting vineyards. And so they're not professionals, but they're just really into their wine. So they want to know a little bit more about wine than the average tourist. So with Rioja, for example, they really would like to get sort of deep into the difference between oak aging and single vineyard, for example. And they've got that kind of quite nerdy, sort of geeky interest in how appellation rules have changed. So we explain all that. And we explain the difference between single vineyard and oak aging. And we explain about the kind of acrimonious discussions that went with that, but in a kind of very, very unthreatening way. When I brief the authors, I always say, can they pitch the information at the sort of wine dinner party level?
Right.
So it sounds like I go to the most boring dinner parties in the world, but...
No, not at all. I'd love to go to one of those.
The sort of dinner party where they say, you know all about wine. Tell us about what's the difference between crusty port and vintage port, that kind of thing. Because it's the sort of thing. And so we tell them all about the differences in the appellation rules and how the appellation rules have been updated for the first time in 100 years, but in an accessible manner. That's basically it. And the reason we think we've hit a niche is because there just isn't anything like this around. And we did a bit of research going to the big bookshops in Piccadilly, Waterstones, Piccadilly in London this is. Went down into the basement level. So in Waterstones in Piccadilly, which is a huge 5-story bookshop, the travel section is the entire lower ground floor. literally thousands and thousands of travel books. The wine section is a shelf this wide on the third floor.
Not very wide for those who are just listening.
Sorry,
Less
yes,
than a
I'm
foot.
putting my hands about 2 feet apart. And we went down, spoke to the wine buyer down there. We spoke to the travel buyer and said, look, we're thinking of producing this book, which is going to be a travel guide to Bordeaux. It's going to be called The Smart Traveller's Wine Guide. And we love the title, by the way, because we think it just hits it exactly. And he said, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we want. Because people come in April, May, they say, we're going to Bordeaux. What's a good Bordeaux wine book? And he has to send them up onto the third floor to buy a 500-page volume on one of the great tomes on Bordeaux, which doesn't fit in your pocket. That's the difference.
Right. No, that definitely is a niche. I absolutely love it. So you've done Rioja. What are the others? Burgundy, Tuscany? No, what are the other regions you've done so far?
No, these are the first two. They're not out yet. They're out. The first two are out in October. So the first two are Rioja and Bordeaux. And then the second two in spring next year are Tuscany and Napa. And after that, it's Switzerland and the Rhone. And I mean, Tuscany and Napa is obvious. Switzerland, the Rhone is obvious. Switzerland is less obvious, but it's a great wine region. The Swiss make the two great cantons either side of Lake Geneva are literally the Toblerone-shaped mountains, like that, with vast valleys, and they are absolutely lined with vineyards. The Swiss make a lot of wine, and they drink it all themselves. They're thirsty people. But also Switzerland has a lot of tourism, so we're trying to sort of teach people about... There's a slight sort of educational thing there as well going on.
Sure. Oh, great concept. Okay, back to Rioja. What's the biggest misconception you think that people have about the region and its wines?
That's an interesting one. I think going back a couple of years now, people think that all Spanish wine is from Rioja. They think Rioja is synonymous with Spain. And a lot of people might look at a wine from the Torres family in Penedès in the far northeast of Spain, the top northeastern corner of Spain, a famous wine like the Sangre de Toro, which everybody knows, or Viña Esmeralda. And they might think, oh, that's Spanish, top Spanish wine, obviously Rioja. And I suppose another thing is that a lot of people still think that Rioja is absolutely only oak aged. That's the sort of famous thing that winey people know about Rioja, is that it's aged in oak and that the aging system and the quality system is based on length of time spent in barrel and bottle rather than on vineyard, rather than on other vinification techniques or whatever. And that, I think you've got a few more questions to ask me about that, but that is one of the major, most important changes that have happened in Rioja in the last 6 or 7 years. The change in the appellation rules, which allows people to put single vineyard and smaller areas on their bottle. And so now they've been celebrating single vineyards for years, but now they can do it legitimately.
That is quite an advance. So let's go back to that first misconception, all wines from Spain are not from Rioja. Let's situate Rioja on the map. First of all, Spain, south of France, east of Portugal. Where is Rioja on a map of Spain, say in relation to Madrid, maybe the major city that most people think of?
Right. Well, if you look at Spain as a square, which it kind of is, and Madrid is really in the geographical centre of Spain.
Okay.
You really can't get much more in the middle than Madrid. And if you go due north of Madrid till you hit the coast, you get to Bilbao.
Which is famous for its architecture. Mm-hmm.
Which is famous, yes. We've got the great Guggenheim, built by Frank Gehry of Marqués de Riscal fame. And if you go down about, a couple of inches from Bilbao, it's an hour's drive south of Bilbao and slightly to the east. So it's really sort of between Madrid and Bilbao, it's about 2/3 of the way up there.
Okay, so that gives us
So it's definitely northern Spain. It's quite eastern as well. It's, it's not that far from the Pyrenees. It's very near Pamplona. So it's quite a sort of eastish and Atlantic influence. It's eastish and northern, really. So it's quite Atlantic influenced rather than Mediterranean influenced.
Right. Okay. And another place that the book mentions is, I'm going to muck this up, but Logroña Tapas Trail. Maybe tell us where that is and what it's all about.
That's Logroño, which is it's the capital of La Rioja, of the province. And it's just a really brilliant, dynamic, medium-sized, brilliant Spanish city. It's a working city. It's got some wonderful, wonderful old streets. It's got some wonderful old churches, wonderful old monuments, but it's very much a solid northern Spanish working city where people just go about their business. It just has this, what they call the Tapas Trail, in Logroño. You asked about Tapas Trail, didn't you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And it's centered on one street called the Calle Laurel, Alaurel, which is just a street of tapas bars, a narrow street, pedestrianized, with literally a tapas bar every 5 steps. And it's just a rite of passage for anybody who loves Spain, anybody who loves wine, anybody who loves anything to do with wine and food. That kind of brilliant sort of Spanish lifestyle, what they call la marcha, the sort of that just kind of, lifestyle centered on food, centered on wine. And these bars, they're very, very basic, a lot of them, just blokes, women standing with one foot on the rail, and you get slammed down a glass of the house red in front of you. A lot of these bars, mind you, will have great wine lists as well. We list the bars in the book. And you also get a tapa. And most of these bars specialize in one particular type of tapa. So one bar will specialize, I can tell you the name in a minute. One bar will specialize purely in mushrooms, in champiñones. And so you'll get a tapa, which is a wonderful, wonderful garlic fried mushrooms, for example. And you stay in there for 20 minutes, half an hour, have a couple of glasses of wine, move on to the next one, and carry on repeating that till 2 a.m.
I love that idea. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah, it's brilliant. It's a wonderful lifestyle, the Spanish lifestyle.
And you called it La Marca, the lifestyle? Is that what you said it was?
No, it's not so much the lifestyle. La Marcha.
La Marcha. To walk? Or
Char. Marcha. Marcha. And it's sort of this kind of energy that you get from seeing a brilliant flamenco dance. It's this kind of energy that has you going out at night and staying out for a long time, just talking and drinking and eating and not getting drunk, crucially. It's not that kind of drinking where you end up legless and falling into a taxi. It's much more.
Right.
And then, of course, you always eat as well, because a lot of Spanish people will consider it uncivilized to drink without eating.
Sure, it is. What are your favorite pairings when it comes to the wine and the tapas there?
Well, the most famous pairing in Rioja, this is really a rule of thumb for any wine region, is that you go with the food that's made, and lamb and Rioja, because lamb is grown and raised in huge numbers in the hills. And lamb and Rioja is a really brilliant combination.
How do they do it?
Oh, they do it in all sorts of ways. They do, depending on the time of year, they do a lot of young lamb, lechazo, which is less than a year old, and they do a lot of roast lamb. The one I particularly love is lamb cutlets, very, very thin cutlets. When they do that, they get a huge sack full of vine cuttings, previous vintages vine cuttings, so dried vine twigs, which is big in Bordeaux as well. They call them sartène in Bordeaux. Sartène, S-A-R-T-N, yeah. And you put a great bunch of these cuttings on the grill and you set fire to them and it flares up. You think you're going to set the place on fire, flares up about 4 feet and then dies down to this intensely hot aromatic ash, which is good to cook on for about 10, 12 minutes. It creates this intense heat without flame. And so you grill your chops on that. And that with a glass of any Rioja, literally any wine from the top to the bottom, it just goes beautifully.
That sounds wonderful. Oh, my goodness. Now, what is the Battle of Wine Festival in Harrow that takes place at the end of June each year? What happens during that?
Yeah, Arrow, yeah. So the Battle of Wine, yeah, I've never been. I have to say, to my shame, I really want to go. It's the classic thing. You end up always being in a wine region at the wrong time, And the Battle of Wine in Arrow is at 29th of June, La Battaglia del Vino. And it's just one of those brilliant, brilliant wine festivals on a par with San Fermines, which is the famous bull running in Pamplona. And there's nice to do bulls in the Battle of Wine. Basically, it's a series of processions and it begins about a week before, on the 23rd of June. And it culminates with everybody going up onto the hill to, what do they call the temple on the hill? They pile up onto the hill. And this is after everybody's been drinking and partying all night. And just proceed to chuck wine all over each other. We've got some brilliant pictures. People come up with kind of kids' water pistols, but really, really high-tech water pistols, as big as Kalashnikov rifles. And you just literally, and people chuck bags of wine at you and they upend buckets over your head. And you end up absolutely drenched in wine.
Very sticky business. Who started that? Like, what is I guess it's just celebrating the joy of wine? I don't know. Let's pour it all over us?
Yeah, I think like a lot of these festivals, it goes back into the mists of time and then people don't know exactly how it started. I'm sure it started probably I don't know, I'll look it up for you, but I imagine it started in medieval times, And of course, I mean, like the tomato festival, it's when you have lots of anything that is also your livelihood. You celebrate it. I suppose it's this kind of almost orgiastic kind of Bacchic rite, where, and I should maybe in medieval times, people actually sort of drowned in vats of wine through sheer exuberance and excitement.
Who knows? Yeah. Well, that sounds like something to put on the old bucket list.
Put on the bucket list. End of June. If you're going to Rioja, go at the end of June.
End of June.
I mean, Americans, it's always packed with Americans, these things.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Any Canadians there as well?
Natalie, sorry, yes, and Canadians, obviously.
That's okay. Just wondering.
Yeah.
Asking for a friend.
Yes.
Cool. So, yeah, go and get sticky. So while we're in Harrow, what is the Barrio de la Estación? I don't know. And why would we want to visit it?
El Barrio de la Estación, yeah. Well, it's absolutely key to the development of Rioja, to the history of Rioja wine and how it came about. And if you like, I'll just explain that in a couple of sentences, because it's absolutely linked with the Barrio de la Estación. So very, very briefly, when phylloxera hit Bordeaux in the 1860s, and I don't need to explain what phylloxera is. Phylloxera is the louse.
The root louse that ate all the vines,
exactly.
Yes, devastated them.
The louse that feeds on the roots of vines and devastated the French vineyard, decimated the French vineyard. 90% was uprooted and killed. And so the French had a thirst for wine. At the same time, and while this was going on, links had already been forged over the last 150 odd years, back to the 1780s, 1790s. Links had been forged with Rioja, because Rioja and Bordeaux are quite close. And in the 19th century, it would have been easier to get to Rioja from Bordeaux than it would be to get to Paris. So there had been quite a lot of interchange of ideas between Rioja and Bordeaux. A few key figures had travelled up to Bordeaux, studied Bordeaux winemaking methods, brought them back to Rioja and explained, it's incredible what they're doing up there. We've got to start making wine in big barrels. Bordeaux is so delicious and they make it in big barrels. Let's do that. Bordeaux do this type of ferment. They do a cold soak. They do this kind of press, etc. Bringing gradually introducing those ideas to Rioja. So there was already this kind of intercourse between the two regions. And so when phylloxera hit, Bordeaux, started importing wine from Rioja in vast quantities. And a lot of this would have arrived in Bordeaux by train, but by horse and cart before the trains sort of kicked in, before the trains became viable. And it would have been relabeled claret and sold on to London and sold on around the world. So this cemented the links. And while this was cementing links between Rioja and Bordeaux, because obviously the Riojans were delighted to sell their wine in vast quantities, at the same time as these sort of financial, commercial, economical links were being cemented, so all the ideas were being cemented as well. And so then about 1890, in order to make the links even stronger and to order to facilitate even more the export of wine to Bordeaux, the station at Arro was built as a way to get wine out of Rioja really fast. And so around that station built up, key entrepreneurial Spanish and French winemakers and business people built their wineries just outside the stations so that you could just chuck the wine straight on the train without any bother whatsoever. And so that's where you have Muga and La Rioja Alta and Cuney and Lopez de Haro, Viña Tondonia. All those wineries were built around between, in the last couple of decades of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And because they were so wealthy, they made very, very good wine, and those are the most famous wineries. And so from a traveller's point of view, from a tourist point of view, to cut a very long story short, if you've got a day in Rioja, 2 days in Rioja, and you've only got like 5 wineries to visit, go to Arro, and these wineries are all within walking distance of each other. There's one spot where you can take a photograph which has Viña Tondonia and La Rioja Alta. You can get it in the same frame. They're so close to each other.
That's great. Sounds like Porto. All the port houses, yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's exactly like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a bit of a museum there, like the history of the region and that sort of thing?
That's a good question, and I shall refer back to the book. I can't remember what the museum is in Arro now, but every winery, all the wineries, they do extensive tours for different prices. You can spend €30, you can spend more, and they all have their own museums, and they have their vast barrel rooms. La Rioja Alta, for example, they demonstrate, the ancient methods of changing barrels by hand, etc. Racking, it's called. So I'll find out the name of the museum. I can't remember it. for now, but you have all the museums you need within the wineries, basically. You've got the history of Rioja there, and they're really geared up for visitors as well.
That's terrific. Wow. So many reasons to visit. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Adam. Here are my takeaways. What makes the Rioja region of Spain a must-visit destination for wine lovers? As Adam explains, what they do so brilliantly in Rioja is combine traditional winemaking and outstanding wines with ultra-modern avant-garde buildings, often next door to ancient, gorgeous medieval churches. Of course, the Marqués de Riscal Winery and Hotel are a wonderful example, as is the Vieira Hotel, which Adam says looks like a collection of white boxes that have just literally been dropped from the sky. They're all higgly-piggly, as he says, all angles, and you can go from the door of this hotel to a medieval church in about 10 steps. What are the best food pairings for Rioja wines? Lamb and Rioja is a brilliant combination, according to Adam, and I agree. And we are speaking about the red Rioja wine. The rule of thumb for any wine region is to pair it with the food that's made in the region. What grows together goes together. Lamb is grown and raised in huge numbers in the Rioja hills, and they prepare it in different ways depending on the time of year. He particularly loves lamb cutlets, so very thin slices of meat. They burn a large bundle of vine cuttings from previous vintages, so they're dried vine twigs on the grill, which they also do in Bordeaux. And the flames will flare up at about 4 feet and then die down to this intensely hot aromatic ash, which is good to cook on for about 10 minutes. It creates this intense heat without flame. And so they grill lamb chops on that. And that, with a glass of Rioja, as Adam says, is just a beautiful thing. What's the sticky history behind the Battle of Wine Festival in Rioja? Well, as Adam observes, when you have lots of anything that is also your livelihood, you celebrate it. The Battle of Wine Festival is a series of processions that begins a week before the 23rd of June and culminates with everyone going up to a hill to what they call the temple. And this is after everyone has been drinking and partying all night, and then they throw wine all over each other. They literally chuck bags of wine at each other and upend buckets over their heads, and end up absolutely drenched in wine. And as you can imagine, that's a sticky business. Like a lot of these festivals, it goes back to the mists of time, and so no one knows how it exactly started. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of my conversation with Adam, links to his website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 162, go back and take a listen. I chat about sherry, Rioja, cava, and other Spanish wine gems with Lawrence Francis. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Sherry is one of the most complex wines out there. Sauterne is always going to have this amazing length and intensity, but sherry in the right hands, you can almost just turn it up. There's so many different colors and different flavors to paint from it. I think they're on the right track in talking about how well it goes with food. Food is a wonderful way to hook people and to get them to want to know more about the wine.
It's a great way into wine itself, but also categories of wine that have maybe suffered from misconceptions, like sherry has often been pegged as the Oxford Dawn University professor wine behind the books, or granny's wine, or whatever, but it is complex. It's nutty. It's wonderful. It has this range of styles from sweet to dry. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Adam. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the wines of Rioja. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, if you'd like to win a copy of Adam's book, or if you've read my book or are listening to it at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and how to fix them forever at nataliemclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/303. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a robust Rioja to pair with a tender lamb cutlet. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.